Well, welcome back. For those of you who follow what now seems like a series that Ryan and I are doing, and we first wanted to apologize for some technical difficulties. So this is being put out on a YouTube channel, and I know for those people who are trying to connect through Substack, which is where we thought we initially would do it, there's a link that's been sent around, but we're also going to post this on Ryan's Substack and my Substack. And you can get that for free by looking at either of our Substacks. Obviously, if you want to subscribe, you can subscribe for free also. And then it'll be out, obviously, on this YouTube channel. And so anyway, apologize for the technical difficulties. There's a reason that Ryan and I teach and don't do this for a living. But we do have some important and interesting things to talk about. The theme today is really ways in which the First Amendment is under assault, and we're going to talk about Harvard. We're going to talk about the Voice of America litigation. But to start off, we're going to talk about something that I think has flown a bit under the radar screen, and Ryan and I both want to share our thoughts and first talk about what happened, but then share why we think this is so important and why it's the first thing that we're going to talk about. You'll recall that we did an analysis of the Department of Homeland Security, a subgroup of it, a council put out intelligence that related to Tren de Aragua, the TDA, the gang that is at the heart of the administration's efforts to deport a whole series of non-citizens who they say are part of the TDA and thus can be summarily removed without due process. The Supreme Court has said, no, you have to have due process. But at the heart of the claim was this idea that the TDA is not only invading our country, but they're doing so on the part of a foreign government, Venezuela. And for the statute, the Alien Enemies Act, to apply, there has to be this connective tissue, that it can't just be any old gang. It has to be a gang that is related to and doing this at the behest of a foreign government. And we talked about that claim and the legal issues involved. And we also talked about the internal document that was revealed by the Department of Homeland Security, and in the spring of this year, that came to a contrary conclusion. That's sort of where we want to start. So everything I've just said is sort of a level setting. But what we want to talk about is something that I think is really pernicious, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to talk about your views, but also what I've left out in terms, because there's some key facts that are important here. But what's so pernicious is what appears to have happened is a concerted effort by at least one senior leader at the Department of Homeland Security to get that conclusion of the intelligence community changed, altered. That is, to change the intelligence assessment, the facts, to better conform to what the administration wanted the facts to be. That is changing the facts. This is, people may recall the famous line of alternative facts by Kellyanne Conway. This is an example that's been reported by the New York Times of that sort of effort to have alternative facts and to try and get the intelligence community to change the intelligence analysis. So there are lots of ways that the First Amendment can be undermined. There's lots of ways that the news can be undermined. But one is to have these career people be bullied into actually altering the facts. So Ryan, with that sort of as a big preview, maybe the place to start is what the New York Times has been reporting, and then what your take is on this.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So This is one of those egregious cases I think we have of cooking the intelligence books, and a lot of evidence of it. The intelligence community, February 26, first made a determination that there was no real linkage between the Venezuelan government and the Tren de Aragua Venezuelan gang. And then the person who interjects and tries to get them to revise their findings is the chief of staff to Tulsi Gabbard, the chief of staff to the director of national intelligence. We know this thanks to intrepid reporting, one of the best reporters out there, Charlie Savage, and his colleagues at the New York Times. And in a way, thankfully, this individual, Joe Kent, who's the chief of staff, this is all according to the reporting, that's all I'm drawing from. Joe Kent, thankfully, put it in writing. He put it in emails to his colleagues, and he says things like, quote, "We need to do some rewriting," end quote. And that the more analytic work, they need to do more analytic work, quote, "so this document is not used against the DNI or POTUS," end quote, meaning Tulsi Gabbard or Trump. And there's some ambiguity with respect to what exactly he was trying to do. But at the end of the day, the ambiguity goes away because the Times has a treasure trove of these internal communications. And it's deeply disturbing what he attempted to do. One piece of potentially good news, as well as, of course, that April 7th, the National Intelligence Council does, in fact, reaffirm their findings. So they don't seem to be bending to this kind of pressure, an attempt to cook the books. There is a bit of a variance with the FBI, so there's an open question as to what the FBI is doing with or in conjunction with this or not. But overall, the intelligence finding stays the same, that there's no real linkage, that if there were these kinds of linkages or cooperation between the gang and the government, that the US intelligence community would have collected that information, and they don't have it. But I think, to me, where it also touches down is in the litigation over the Alien Enemies Act, because we now have some district court judges saying that they will defer to the president's factual allegations when it comes to these kinds of very specific allegations, like, is the Venezuelan gang operating at the direction of the Venezuelan government, which on its face seems a bit of an absurdity, but we know now it's not even just on its face and a bit of an absurdity. The intelligence community contradicts that very finding. So I'm quite worried that district court judges are going to pursuing this path where they aren't deferring to the executive in all things, but on this particular issue, factual allegations by the president in the Alien Enemies Act proclamation. Stephanie Haynes, a judge in the Western District of Pennsylvania, in fact, makes renders an opinion in which she does. It's the very first judge to uphold the Alien Enemies Act, and she does, in fact, say, "I'm going to treat as truth what the president says on the face of the proclamation." And she does that after the April 7th Intelligence Council's memorandum is declassified and publicly available. And now we have this new report from Charlie Savage and others at the Times showing what they're trying to do inside the DNI, inside the intelligence community, to cook the books. And at a minimum, I think it's about the erosion of public trust in the court's ability to police this kind of activity. The idea that you would give carte blanche to the president is, to me, absurd. That's an abdication of the judicial role, of some level of review. Deference to the executive, sure. But how much deference? And then, given that now we know what's happening behind the scenes, I think there's no way that the executive branch should get away with that, or that I shouldn't say the executive branch, the White House should get away with that.
So a few comments. One, I think I misspoke earlier when I think I may have kept saying DHS as opposed to DNI. It tells you I've been out of Washington long enough that I get my acronyms confused, but to the extent that I can't remember if I did, but if I said DHS, I meant DNI. DNI is the National Intelligence Agency that oversees the entire intelligence community. It sits on top of them. It was created post 9/11. Department of Homeland Security is a component of the intelligence community, Department of Homeland Security, obviously. So my apologies for that. Second, Ryan, a factual question. I don't know that we have, but correct me if I'm wrong, a complete apples to apples. That, in other words, I know that we have the released report, the one that's sort of the final, which it's clear that the intelligence community has not caved in the sense that they make conclusions that are certainly in significant tension with the government's position, the administration's position on the Alien Enemies Act in court. But I'm not sure if we know, because we have the prior version, the one that led to the effort by the chief of staff to have that rethought or rewritten. And so I don't know that we have a complete comparison to see whether there were words or adjectives changed, or, for instance, the FBI is a slight outlier in the public report, saying that there are individuals in the Venezuelan government who they believe are coordinating with TDA, but they actually agree with the ultimate conclusion of the intelligence community that TDA is not operating at the behest of the government. But I don't think we know precisely what all the changes are, if any, between the first and second version. Is that right?
That's correct. The way the Times reports it is that they say the second version reaffirmed the first version, but there's one particular line in the report by the New York Times that to me was a bit of a puzzle. And I dropped the link to the New York Times report in the chat, the live chat. And here's the puzzle. At the end, near the end of the New York Times report, it says the following, quote, Mr. Kent is said to have reacted happily to the final version of the second memo and ordered it declassified so that it could be discussed publicly, end quote. And to me, that raises the real question of, well, were there actual changes between version 1 and version 2 that modified it more in his direction, and that's why he did it? It's hard to see that, given that the Times has reported that the second memo reaffirmed the first findings, and it's also hard to see that because the second memo that's being declassified is so damning against the White House and what they were trying to say in court. In fact, it contradicts what they were saying in court. I've created a timeline on that. So I think his happiness over the second memo, to me, might best be explained by the same individual who is making the extraordinary, ill-advised, poor judgment type moves of even trying to get them to change their findings and trying to do that in writing. So that's my best explanation for what's going on there. But no, we don't
Yeah.
know the.
So we
Yeah.
don't. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I don't think we really know. It's because the language in the New York Times reporting is susceptible of different readings. It's possible, for
Mhm.
instance, that the general tenor did not change, but for instance, the FBI changed. I mean, and
Yeah.
it became sort of a little bit of an outlier. We just don't know that piece. Um, I wanted to now turn. We've been talking sort of about part of this is big picture, which is this idea of changing intelligence so it conforms with facts that you want. Many people say that we went to war over things like this, sort of famously during the Bush II administration, with this idea of intelligence that's molded to fit facts intelligence facts that are molded to fit a determined outcome as opposed to guiding what you should do, which is, of course, how it should work. And of course, it's obvious to say this, but there's absolutely no repercussions for anybody. And this is flown under the radar screen, which is in other administrations, this would be a huge deal. So I did want to raise on the legal front, though, your point about judges who might say, oh, well, we defer to the conclusions, even though there's no underlying factual details. We just sort of rubber stamp and affirm what the president and the executive is determining with respect to the relationship of Venezuela to the TDA, um, and and that there's sort of no review whatsoever. And here's the hypothetical, which Ryan, I've raised with you before, but imagine a situation where, and this is a hypothetical, where there was a tape recording and a video of senior leadership in an administration. Take it out of the Trump administration, where somebody who's sitting in the White House says, "We're going to make this up. We're going to lie," and they issue a proclamation that says this gang is acting at the behest of foreign government, Z, and that's all recorded. But the proclamation comes out. At that point, does the court say, well, the law is, because it's a national security and foreign affairs matter, that we just rubber stamp and take this conclusion, and we don't in any way look behind it? That can't be the law, right? That just can't be. And so is it that you only do this when you have a smoking gun? Like, I understand deference, but there has to be some level of review, meaning there has to be, and it's in the law for people who are not lawyers. A lot of times people say for when there's is there strict scrutiny? In other words, there has to be a really tight fit between what you want to do and the factual predication. Sometimes it's just a rational relationship. Is there a rational reason for what you're doing? Here, even if it's sort of a very loose standard of review, there has to be some review. And it seems to me that this kind of information is, I'm not, we don't have all the facts. There would have to be a hearing, but if it turns out that somebody has cooked the books, as you said, then of course there shouldn't be that kind of rubber stamping that goes on. And so that's, I think, what's wrong with the courts that just say, we're just going to go with what the president says regardless, as if you can slap on an adjective, which is his favorite technique, without giving any underlying facts. It's like there was fraud in the election, but there's no facts to support it.
Yeah, and one additional point on how the judges are deciding these cases, and then I want to go to that same big picture that you mentioned, Andrew. One of them is, I think maybe for some of the judges, what they're trying to do is what judges often do, which is like split the baby or give a little bit to one side, a little bit to the other side, where the conduct by the White House with respect to the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act is totally outrageous, and it has no factual basis. There's no invasion, there's no war, and newsflash, Tren Aragua is not a foreign government. It's a small collection of a gang, a terrifying gang, but a gang. I think what some of the judges are trying to do is, in at least two of the cases, Judge Sweeney and Judge Rodriguez, they're finding against the administration. They're saying, oh, if you look at the proclamation, it does not meet the definition of invasion, predatory incursion, or war. We're done. You can't use the Alien Enemies Act. It's invalid. But on these findings of like factual allegations, relationship between Tren Aragua and Maduro and the Maduro regime, we'll give that one to the president. And I think it's really troubling, because then you have Judge Haynes come along and say, oh, okay, I'm just going to find that the proclamation's fine on the first grounds, and I'm going to agree with you on the second one. And
it's a blueprint. It's a blueprint.
Yeah,
it's a blueprint for creating exactly what that idea of, like, you sit there and go, oh, all I have to say is X. Well, that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah. And the other one, I want to go back to your point about the big picture, that cooking the intelligence books has taken the nation to war before. And that's one of the most existential threats to the country, in a certain sense, of that kind of action on the part of a White House. I don't think it's just a stretch or an analogy or a metaphor for what's going on here. I put in the chat, after you said that, Andrew, I hadn't thought about it before, a link to CNN's reporting that inside the White House, they are considering ways in which they could actually invoke more war powers against the drug cartels, including labeling them as enemy combatants that could be subject to lethal targeting. I mean, really, like, that's as dangerous and unsupported. I also have an expertise in international humanitarian law. There's no threshold armed conflict. Like, you can't really get there by law. But the fact that they're contemplating that, how would they do that? They would do it on the backbone of false intelligence like this. I don't know how you would ever be able to even assert anything like that publicly without suggesting that you have intelligence that backs up these linkages, which we now know they don't, thanks to the New York Times, and thanks to the
So,
people who worked on the FOIA work.
yeah, and just a quick shout out to Charlie Savage. You know, he's somebody, whatever people think of the New York Times leadership, and there certainly are issues there. They still have some remarkable reporters, and first among them is Charlie Savage, who covers national security and is very, very sober in his reporting. And in fact, here his initial reporting was criticized by the Department of Justice, but it turns out he was right, and the Department of Justice saying that it was accurate was wrong. So, you know, it really, you know, kudos to him for sticking to his guns and doing what reporters need to do, particularly at this time in our history. Ryan, can we talk now about the extraordinary continued attack on Harvard? I think if people are listening to this, they know that the latest is this letter from, now it is the Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. This is why I think I was thinking about it, but no excuses, my bad. And the letter from Kristi Noem basically says, your international students and visiting scholars out. Unless they were to transfer to another university, they can't stay at Harvard and have a working visa. And as of right now, all these people cannot sort of be here at the university. Obviously, that causes huge issues for Harvard. It sends shockwaves and chilling effects to other universities and to many other students. There's so much to say about it, but I wanted to focus on the First Amendment issue in a small way first, which is I was struck by two things that were in this Department of Homeland Security letter to Harvard. And one is a statement that the Trump administration is not going to tolerate anti-Americanism on campus. That was the phrase, anti-Americanism. So that's one. And then the second is there was a list of 6 categories of information that the Department of Homeland Security says the reason they're taking this action is because all this information has not been turned over to the Department of Homeland Security by Harvard. And one of the pieces of information, it's actually number 6, is essentially all audio and video recordings of any protests engaged in by non-immigrant students. Leave aside, by the way, that non-immigrant students, I mean, it's a term of art, but technically that means every citizen as well, because they're non-immigrants. But in any event, leave that aside. All protest activity, that would include, and that's to be clear, peaceful protest. That is First Amendment activity. You know what's also First Amendment activity? You may not like anti-Americanism, but that is First Amendment protected speech. I mean, I don't like anti-Americanism. I'm an American. I'm very proud of it, and I think the country is great. I disagree with a lot of what's going on right now, but that's my right, and it's Ryan's right to talk about it. The people who are listening to this, it is your First Amendment right not only to talk about it, but to hear people talk about it. The First Amendment works both ways, both speaking and listening. And you can also engage in peaceful protests. And so that is all core First Amendment activity. And it was remarkable to me that this letter, which was clearly vetted, it's clearly a lawyer's letter. Somebody worked through it, and yet there's these categories that I think is going to, just again as a small legal matter, I think if I'm Harvard, I am going to be like a duck on a June bug, like right on this, to be saying here's the problem. Like this is a direct attack on the First Amendment.
Yep. And I just put in the chat 2 items. One, a link to Just Security's litigation tracker, but it links you directly to the Harvard complaint from this morning, which with the Just Security will also be updating that with the filings by the government and the court itself, etc. And they, in fact, lead with the First Amendment as the main issue in the opening narrative. I recommend folks read just the first couple pages at least, because I think that they're written in some ways for you all. They're written for a general audience, not just for the court, to say what's going on here. And they talk about it as why is Harvard being signaled out by the administration? It's retaliation for exercising their own First Amendment and associational rights and expressive rights. And the list of grievances in the DHS's public statement yesterday includes like who one of the schools, I think is the Divinity School, selected as one of their marshals at convocation. I mean, talk about an right expressive freedom right. Whoever they decide to choose, that's their First Amendment right. And you can't condition grants on the exercise of constitutional rights. That's one of the Harvard's arguments. The other piece that I put into the chat that I read yesterday, I thought was really good. So it preceded the complaint, is Professor Eugene Volokh, who is no liberal law professor, and he's always been very strong in the First Amendment, regardless of administration. He also articulates why the grounds that the administration has explicitly stated in its communications with Harvard and the public are First Amendment grounds. And even if they could now try to scurry over to what looked like facially neutral grounds for penalizing Harvard, the ways in which they have selected out Harvard would still raise the same First Amendment issues. And that's what he articulates in that one as well. And plus, there are other aspects of the law here that I wonder what exactly is the strategy on the part of the administration. The Harvard complaint is so strong. It's also strong just purely on the basis of what is the normal procedure under the regs for the administration to pursue a university that they think is not in compliance. And this looks like just a summary decision which does not have an articulated rational basis for it, and just avoids some of the procedures. For example, that Harvard is supposed to be given a notice of intent to withdraw this certification, and then weeks to be able to respond to it. And also, what's very good about Harvard is that their complaint is filled with an annex of different documents. If you go to the court docket, you can see them yourself, providing us what were the communications back and forth with the government. And I'll just say that it's at this stage, maybe the government will come back with something else, but at this stage, it just seems so strong for Harvard. It seems as though what the administration is doing, and this is no big surprise, is just very symbolic. It's trying to tarnish Harvard's reputation, hurt Harvard, and damage them with respect to students who will now fear that these will be the repercussions for their status, even though I assume a court will stop it immediately with a temporary restraining order. So I think that's the game that's being played, and the strength of Harvard's legal position is very, very good.
I'm not surprised. I saw that one of the lawyers is a former general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security, so is very aware of the regulations and the sort of ins and outs. I wanted to again step back to the idea of using, or in this case, abusing the First Amendment by attacking not just academia and particularly Harvard, which is, I mean, this is so part of this sort of, in my view, sort of an anti-fact, anti-science, anti-elite view, even though, by the way, Harvard, it's elite in the terms of you have to be incredibly smart and qualified to get in, but it has quite a diverse population. And in fact, that's part of the targeting, is that the sort of racial diversity, the national diversity is what's being targeted. And I just want to step back for a moment and talk a point I've made in various other contexts in the podcasts I do with Mary McCord, Main Justice, my Substack. this is so stupid as a policy matter. I mean, that's why that it's not being done because it's good policy. It may be good politics for the MAGA base, but the idea that this country isn't stronger because of international students and scholars and scientists, and being a place where we attract the best and the brightest internationally to our shores. I mean, that is a huge measure of why America has been as good as it is in a whole range of topics. Whether, I mean, the arts, the sciences, the, politics, just there's no end of areas where you can't identify people who have come here. And what you're doing is making us sort of having a brain drain from this country, and it's only going to redound to the benefit of other countries. And you're seeing it already, where England and France and other countries are going to try and capitalize on this, as well they should. I mean, that's what we would do in that situation, which is to say, you know what, we can provide the security and the stability and the education and the resources that you had hoped you would be able to get in America. So in terms of this just being as a policy, leave aside the sort of illegality, the amorality of it, in my view, just as a policy matter, with many, many other examples of this kind of flight from an authoritarian regime.
Yeah, yeah, and in terms of our upside down world, I mean, this is just one dimension of it, but anti-Americanism, talk about spreading anti-Americanism is to do things like this. So I taught at Harvard for 7 years, and I have to say that, for foreign students to get to come to Harvard and be educated there, I think in some sense it breeds pro-Americanism. Like, it leaves a indelible impression on their life, on their professional careers, and for as they go back to their home countries and the like. Those kinds of student exchanges, student experiences are an important part of the lifeblood of pro-Americanism. And, so to do that, this just assault, and to use these thousands of foreign students who are right now on Harvard's campus, because this idea that DHS says it takes immediate effect, as pawns, as though they're just like little pieces that can be squashed with respect to whatever the squabble is with Harvard's leadership, is just extraordinary. And in a week of promoting anti-Americanism, to me, I'm going to tie it in with something that it was in the chat. Somebody mentioned this as well, but to me, it even connects up with the president's meeting in the Oval Office with the president of South Africa, and that gross display of parroting a completely debunked conspiracy theory about white genocide, a racist and factually invalid conspiracy theory that was shown by news media immediately afterwards, lots of debunking of it. Think about how the African continent that Trump referred to in that Oval Office meeting thinks about that. Think about how the rest of the world thinks about that. Just that the president of the United States is communicating disinformation based on a racist conspiracy theory in the Oval Office, trying to browbeat another head of state. That's where it's anti-Americanism. I really do think that's a significant setback to U.S. foreign policy on the continent, in Africa and elsewhere. And what's happening by assaulting Harvard, which they're doing Harvard just as a exemplar for higher education,
Right.
and for how they think about foreign students, I think is deeply troubling.
So why don't we take a turn now to Voice of America, and Ryan, what's going on there? Why should people? What is Voice of America? And it's actually the case we're going to talk about actually involves not just the Voice of America. There's sort of Radio Free Europe. There's other media outlets. But what is it, and what's the litigation over? What's happening to them?
Yeah, so I think of them as global media outlets. Some of them are differently situated than Voice of America. So Voice of America is internal to the US government, and the other ones are external. They get external grants. So that's like Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Middle East News Network. And all of these cases have kind of come together and are marching their way forward in the DC circuit. And there was a big victory at the district court level in which the district courts had preserved these outlets from grant cutoffs, staffing reductions in the case of Voice of America, and the like. It's very complicated. It's one of the most complicated litigation postures I've seen. That goes up to the DC circuit. A panel 2-1 overturns the district court order or district courts, plural orders in large part. Then they're reversed by the full DC circuit acting en banc, except for Voice of America. And that was what was hanging out there. Everybody was waiting to see what would happen with Voice of America. So right now for the other outlets, the DC circuit en banc has basically said, look, freeze things with status quo, that they receive their funding, et cetera, because of the irreparable harms. And to just get into that point of it, what's really at stake here, these are different media outlets that were set up for bipartisan support from Congress throughout their lifespan of these companies, and they broadcast news reporting into countries that have closed societies where there's no real access or there's lack of access to free media. So they're counteracting Chinese propaganda on the COVID vaccine, on the Uyghur genocide, on things like that. They're countering ISIS's anti-American violent extremist messaging in Middle East News Network. Voice of America was initially set up to counter Nazi propaganda. And this is the first time ever that Voice of America has gone dark, is what one of the judges explained. Yesterday was a big setback. Yesterday, the DC Circuit said we're not going to reconsider the panel decision, the 2-1 decision, with respect to the staffing of Voice of America. So in other words, right now, the Trump administration does not need to reinstate all of the staff that they put on leave or terminated at Voice of America. And Voice of America has gone essentially dark because of this.
So
Yeah.
Brian, let me just make sure, because there's a lot of appellate litigation in this, but with respect to the sort of radio free media, there is a temporary pause with respect to funding and staffing that's been imposed by the courts. And so, but the administration is trying to both cut its funding and cut its staff. With Voice of America, it actually has cut the staff, and it's going to be able to go forward with that, and doesn't need to reinstate those people. And as one of the judges who is in the dissent said, this sort of, it's basically turning it into rubble.
Yes.
And that if they ever got reinstated later, they'd be returning to a sort of a bombed out village. And that was sort of her argument for why there should be a stay. Do I have that right? That's sort of where the sort of lay of the land is currently?
Yeah, and I just slight amendment when you said that the courts have paused the funding. It's the courts have paused the funding cutoffs. That's one.
Yeah.
And two is, I think this is an additional point. The courts have not said that the administration is legally correct in what it's doing. The only reason that they have said that they are not finding against the administration now for a temporary restraining order or the like, or a preliminary injunction on the staffing at Voice of America, is because of jurisdiction, that those complaints should be brought in a different forum, is the argument by the DC panel. So it's not like Trump has won on that this is legal. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure people understand, because it so relates to the other, where there's a reason we're sort of doing these together. This is one where it really is the big picture, because we don't really have the time, and I think probably people would find it boring to go into sort of the details of the claims in the particular lawsuit. But just so people understand what the administration is doing, there's no reason that I can think of, a good faith reason why an American democracy would not be supporting these institutions. As you noted, their mission is to have truthful information go out to people, to have fair and balanced reporting, and to have that go out in regimes where there isn't that kind of reporting.
Hmm.
And so you really have to think about what is the administration doing when it's aligning itself with the idea of having state-run media and not having a challenge to it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that this is a huge part of what Republicans and Democrats, as you said, a bipartisan effort when we think about Voice of America. This isn't about quibbling over, oh, we think that some of their stories were wrong, or there's too much of a liberal bias, and we want to make sure it's being even-handed. Like that, there isn't really a good argument for that. There's no getting from A to B from that, even if you thought some of their stories should be covered differently. So to me, it's very hard to view this as anything but this is what, if your playbook is authoritarianism, where you're attacking the idea of an independent, fair and balanced media, then you don't want Voice of America preaching outside of the United States, and you don't want that inside the United States. In other words, you want media that is going to parrot. And to me, that's the point of the Charlie Savage article. And what he was reporting on was this idea that we want the intelligence community to parrot, not to, we want to have the intelligence follow the policy, not to have the intelligence community follow the facts. And again, I just think it's hard to separate this when you put it all together,
Hmm.
what's going on. And you can view the Harvard piece in very similar ways.
Yep, absolutely. Because Harvard is at its core First Amendment issue about trying to um, basically crunch down on an institution to change, as Harvard says, using the administration's words back on it, ideology. And that's like a liberal arts college ideology, I think, is what they're concerned about. And then to add one aspect of it, so Carrie Lake, who is in charge of these global media outlets for the government, recently said that she would want them, Voice of America, to be carrying OAN content, One American News, which in my view, is like further out there than like Fox, Newsmax, One American News, and especially in terms of factual reliability. So I think that would be a mouthpiece for this particular administration. So I do think these all connect up. And what does it mean? It's not about an assertion of power. It's just I think it's about an assertion. Sorry, not about an assertion of truth. It's about a pure assertion of power in all of these instances.
And this is where I'm just going to say something personal, which is, when I think about the best of academia, I think of you,
Oh.
because you are somebody who operates by what is the data and how do I deal with it, and is that a fair point? And you're always reassessing based on the data. My dad was a scientist, and he kept on thinking, that the way science works is incrementally over time, where you keep on doing different experiments, you get data, you get facts, and you revisit what's happening. And he said, and that'll happen generation after generation. And it's obviously fact-based, and it's easy to understand there because there either will be a cure, and the penicillin will work, or it won't, or aspirin will work or it won't, or a vaccine works or it doesn't. But that's because it's data driven and you revise based on that. There's no amount of groupthink and wishful thinking that's going to get you to penicillin. And so it's the same when you're thinking about any other area where you have to be data driven. Obviously, there are areas that are more subjective than the sort of hard sciences, but there still is data that is needed, and not just adjectives, and certainly not false data to support your views. And that sort of attack on the truth is something that connects everything that we just talked about. It connects the DNI, Harvard, and the Voice of America pieces, and it is such a dangerous road, because as Amy Berman Jackson said during one of the cases she heard during the Mueller investigation, in the courts of law, facts still matter. And Susan Gallagher has repeated that same thing. She is a Trump-appointed judge from the first Trump administration who said, this is an evidence-based forum. And that's what that means. And that is the real attack that we're witnessing today.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. And also just thanks to you, even just for this conversation. I can see from the chat, and if folks see this later, not live, keep looking down because I'm looking at the chat and interacting with people there. But I think for me, the conversation just with you, Andrew, has helped me even think through this as well in terms of connecting the different dots. Even initially, when I thought about the different cases, and we had discussed beforehand, what do we want to discuss with folks today? I was not seeing it, all of these connections, but it's so obvious now through working this out with you, and really appreciate that. One other item, just in the chat, a number of people are very worried about a provision in the House Reconciliation Bill stripping courts of potentially trying to strip courts of their ability to enforce contempt rulings. And I just want to recommend to people an awesome piece written by the Dean of Berkeley, Erwin Chemerinsky, who is a renowned constitutional law scholar. And we published him on Monday, I think it was, of this week, specifically about that provision. So we definitely have our eye on that. A lot of people are very worried about that.
And I just want to say, I mean, we should do another one of these shortly on this, but I think people should take a deep breath on that. I actually think it is terrible that it's in the House bill. It's not clear it'll get through that part will get through the Senate, but I do think that the courts will have other ways to deal with this, and that it's not fatal to the idea of holding people in contempt. I think the real issue, and the one to keep an eye on, is still the idea that the executive branch won't be following orders. And at the end of the day, as we've talked about, there are various tools that the courts have, but none of them are ideal because, of course, there is no judicial branch army to enforce them. And I think that still will be the issue, regardless of whether this bill does go into become law. I still think it doesn't do as much as I think some people are saying it does. So I do think people should, I think I'd worry mostly about the executive branch just saying no to the courts, and not following their orders, which is what's going on right now in various places. And I'm saying that not based on opinion, based on judges having made those findings, either definitively or preliminarily. So that's just a quick aside on that.
Yeah, great. And stay tuned, because I'm sure you and I are going to have many more conversations about that particular topic of contempt of court.
Okay, well, nice to see you, Ryan.
Great to see you.
Take care.
Bye.